Welcome to the Peacebuilding Practitioner, a resource page and podcast for people working on conflict, on peacebuilding, and on social justice issues. My name is Björn Eser, and I'm the founder of and shaker and maker behind the Peacebuilding Practitioner. Welcome back to Season 3 of the Peacebuilding Practitioners podcast. Season 3 is all about digital peacebuilding, this highly complex, tremendously exciting, often messy and quickly developing intersection where emerging technologies and the digital world on the one hand and conflict transformation, peacebuilding, human rights and social justice work on the other hand meet. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Emma Baumhofer. Emma is a peacebuilding expert at swisspeace, and she says from herself, or it says on her LinkedIn page, that she's a big proponent of storytelling, of data visualization, and of finding opportunities for innovation amidst constraints. That sounds promising, and I think with this little introduction, we're off to a good start. Welcome, Emma. It's nice having you on this episode of the Peacebuilding Practitioners podcast.
Hi, Bjorn. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Emma, we are now off to this series of the Peacebuilding Practitioner podcast, which focuses on digital peacebuilding. So let's hear a bit more. How did you come to digital peacebuilding? What's your role at the moment? And what do you find fascinating about this topic?
Yeah, sure. I find lots of things fascinating about it. I actually came into peacebuilding. I came into digital peacebuilding, freshly into peacebuilding. So that's not where my background comes from. Academically, I am a historian and I focused on migration and gender issues. But then I'm from California, so I started my career in Silicon Valley working for tech startups, and I kind of have found digital peacebuilding as a blend of these different worlds, bringing together the digital strategy, but also this humanities focus. So that's what I like a lot about this field.
Yeah, great. And at the moment you're working at swisspeace. Can you tell us a bit more about swisspeace's approach to digital peacebuilding? Or before we go into the nitty-gritty details, what role, what place does digital peacebuilding play in your overall portfolio and in your current project work?
Yeah, so my role at swisspeace is to lead the digital peacebuilding portfolio. So that's my sole objective and mandate at swisspeace. But we have different thematic areas that we focus on, and several of my colleagues are also interested in digital topics as well, that they do kind of from their specific vantage points. So what I try to do is do some like maybe more isolated digital peacebuilding work, but then also really to work across our different thematic areas and like draw the digital aspects out from there. So I can give a few examples of what I'm talking about. Like with our mediation team, we'll work on things like digital facilitation or how to hold online conversations as part of like dialogue processes. I work with our Dealing with the Past team on topics related to open source preservation. So thinking about really how investigators, for example, and researchers can preserve evidence for the long term.
Yeah.
And then I do analysis. So I work a lot with our gender advisor. We work at this gender digital nexus. This is an important aspect for our team at swisspeace. So we're trying to figure out how, like, for example, gender-based violence is experienced differently or enacted differently in digital spaces. And this kind of links to this kind of connection between online and offline. And then maybe finally, the last point I'll mention at this moment is that we do a lot of capacity building at swisspeace. We're associated with the University of Basel, so we have a lot of different courses on all of our different work. And I have a course on digital peacebuilding. So doing workshops and trainings and different kind of upskilling of the peacebuilding community on digital topics is another big focus for us.
Yeah, great. Thank you for giving us this little overview. I'm sure most people in the audience know swisspeace. If you don't, or if you haven't checked out the website recently, it's really worth visiting the website and finding out more about the different strengths of work and where it all comes together, or where you actually influence others on digital issues. Yeah, so let's probably dive in so that we have a joint understanding. What's your definition of digital peacebuilding? It's such a big and new and still emerging field that it's probably good to first talk a bit about terminology and then explore that a bit further.
Yeah, I agree. So I use a two-part typology to describe digital peacebuilding, and one part of that is the tools. So figuring out how we can better use digital tools and spaces to enhance our peace building work. So that's one part of the typology. But then the other part is understanding the impact of digital tools and spaces on our lives, on society, on peace and conflict. So it's both how we can use tools and how we can better understand the impact on our work.
Yeah, so let's probably explore that a bit further because I'm really interested. We said digital spaces. What does it mean, digital and spaces? Spaces for conflict, where conflict dynamics play out, where they're also now newly influenced by digital factors, digital key driving factors within the digital realm. But also, what does it mean using digital spaces for peace, and how do they come together? So can you tell us a bit more about your understanding and your insights into spaces, places
Yeah.
for conflict and peace building, conflict transformation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's funny because I do talk about digital tools and spaces, and sometimes maybe it feels like they're the same thing. But when I have in mind with digital spaces, it's kind of like these places that we just enter into. So, for example, it could be like comment sections on social
Mm.
media. It could be different group chats on different sorts of channels. I mean, it's kind of a place that you did not design and facilitate yourself, but that you can go in and interact. It could be a Discord server, for
Yeah, yeah.
example. And so these are all places that I think we can, as a first step, watch and listen and learn and kind of see how people are interacting there. But it's also a chance for us to bring in our peace building skills. So to work on depolarization, to work on bridge building, and to kind of enter into these spaces with a peace builder's kind of mindset and do our work like within these spaces. And this is a little bit different, I think, than how we can leverage digital tools where I might post an online dialogue that I have designed the space myself. I'm facilitating it. I'm inviting who is there. I'm having some direction on how the event is taking place. And so that's kind of how I distinguish between these tools and spaces.
That's really interesting because lots of the discussions at the moment, as you said, is really on how can we either set up our own tools or how can we use tools specifically for peace building interventions, no matter if it's on the analysis phase, it's implementation phase, monitoring, evaluation phase, or on something different. But here where you say, okay, no, let's engage with the world as it is. Where are spaces, where are places which are existing, where people interact, and where people probably interact partly similar to what they did in the kinetic world before, and as they do still do, but also probably with different dynamics. Can you tell us a bit more on your insights? How are conflict dynamics differently? What shifts can we expect, or what shifts have you observed in terms of conflicts taking place in these spaces?
Sure. A few comments on that. For one thing, I think we have to be careful to separate them maybe a little bit too much because I do think that we have inequalities that were built offline that tend to get taken online, and so
Yeah.
then we kind of do recreate these issues there. So sometimes it's not always so different. But I mean, there's also, I mean, we know about digital conflict drivers. We can see that the way certain platforms are built, they're creating the frame for how we are communicating. So we're talking about the algorithms that kind of choose which content gets spread faster or pushed to the top of the feed. And we're also seeing, I mean, like in comment sections, these tend to be the places where a lot of hate speech and kind of polarizing conversations take place within the comment section. So having a comment section, having these features like to be making it easy to quickly share content with other people, whether or not you have maybe clicked on the link and even read the piece of information yourself. I mean, these are all kind of features of the technology that
Mm.
are affecting the way people are communicating when they're on these platforms, and that are just different from when we're talking face to face or in other offline places.
Yeah. You just mentioned some of the technology is built around click bites where you say, okay, time on the platform counts. And if the platform can draw in people through full on sex sells, crime sells, certain picture sells, extreme positions sell and attract people. So that's an environment where you said that scales up pretty quickly, that attracts people. And that's what the business model of these online spaces very often is. And at the same time, we engage with them as peace builders and see what does it mean if we use these spaces, if we are in these spaces and bring peace building ideas in. What does it mean for your work?
Well, I think we can also remember that digital spaces are sometimes also the safer spaces. I mean, because when we're working in conflict areas where it's just not safe to meet
Mm.
physically in person, or it's maybe too sensitive, people are not ready to meet in person. I mean, I do think that digital spaces sometimes are the safe spaces, or they at least are good starting point of a space of like when you're actually going to try to have some sort of a dialogue with a little less contact that could then maybe lead into offline spaces. So I think that's also one thing to focus on right now, is that it kind of positive potential, or to maybe reframe a little bit how we're talking about how to approach our concept of these digital spaces and their potential for peace work.
Yeah. Could you give some examples where your insights and your work and your understanding also of these spaces and the work of your colleagues, which you mentioned earlier, work on mediation or work on dealing with the past, working on memory processes, how do you support each other? How do you draw on complementary knowledge to really make sure we use the strengths of each of these approaches and bring it together for, let's say, a wider array, more possibilities to actually engage in peace processes, in conflict transformation, in social justice, and other related work?
I mean, that's a great question. I think this is like a challenge and an opportunity like point, because I think at Swiss Peace, we really do try to work across these areas, and sometimes we do it better than others. I mean, I would say, to take a step back, this is a challenge for digital peace building and trying to get it a bit more mainstreamed and integrated, because I think we probably do approach digital peace building a little too much as it's its own thing rather
Yeah,
than just
yeah,
a part of peace building in general. But I can say more specifically, at least at Swiss Peace. So I mentioned at the start that I work with our Dealing with the Past team on open source preservation. So
yeah.
this was, I mean, we started out here by writing an essential together, doing some workshops together, also like including digital components in our different courses that we offer. And so in this case, it was really about how do we, I can bring in the specific expertise of the qualities of digital information and how it
Yeah,
needs to be
yeah.
treated and found online. But then they really bring in all of their years and years of experience on like the importance of this type of evidence for specifically dealing with past processes. So for legal purposes, but also for memory, for research, for memorialization, and so on. And so I think that was a good example of how we could kind of merge together these different areas. And then likewise on with mediation, I mean, I have to say COVID was certainly a big push in this regard of
Yes.
like, okay, we have to deal with this, you know,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
in a way it was a positive outcome, because it's, I mean, it's also something we're still continuing to work towards, but how can we really not feel like the digital space is like the leftover that we have to do, even though perhaps that was the push where we couldn't meet in person, so it forced us to go online. But now we kind of really try to evaluate what are the better conversations to have online and what are the better conversations to have offline. So I think we're getting much better at kind of evaluating these different opportunities and weaving them together. So we're
Yeah.
not just doing an online only dialogue, but that we use it for these key moments, and then we make sure it feeds into offline processes, because that also just helps with the relationship building and so on as well.
I think that's really important, which sometimes seems to be forgotten or misconceived, that it's complementary. It's not supposed to be done instead of. It's not supposed to push other processes, other approaches off the stage, but really to be yet another way of saying, how can we really draw on the strengths of the potential strengths and make sure people find something where they feel safe and where they feel appreciated to engage in these processes. And for some, that digital is a great way. And for others, they say, well, actually, this is not for me, or only in certain circumstances. And I think it's great to hear where you say, okay, how does your background, your deep understanding, and your personal experiences actually help others who have their experience, their proven track record in these more face-to-face processes? How do you come together and tease out the strengths to really make it conducive, inclusive, participatory processes? Great. We said earlier, you mentioned COVID. For all of us, I think it was one way you said, well, either we just sit down and do nothing, or we embrace the possibilities if we have and learn while we go ahead with a steep learning curve. I still remember right in the beginning of the first lockdown when we had discussions around changing ownerships, about agency, about power redistribution, where we thought maybe more localized process where people take the existing digital possibilities and make good use of them. At the same time, I think there's, again, also some sobering where I said, well, maybe, again, it's very much driven by big players. What is your insight? Where do we have the feeling that the use for peace building, for conflict transformation, and for human rights work, digital spaces in combination with the kinetic world process, where do you have the feeling we see shifting power balances, we see more local ownership, we see agency shifting, and we see more safe spaces for certain minorities, for groups who never felt really included or safe in these processes? Are there new insights where you see there is huge potential?
For specifically using digital?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely potential. I don't think that part is the question. I think, yeah, it's more about this question of how to evaluate. It's not a one size fit all thing. It's not that digital is always going to be more inclusive, and so on. But I mean, for example, we're working on a scoping study that look at the gender digital nexus right now, and we're talking with many civil society actors in Cameroon for this study, specifically talking a lot with women mediators and
Mhm.
discussing like their relationship with technology, how it is like both positive and negatively affecting their work. And I mean, I certainly can see a huge opportunity there, or they're telling us about the positive ways that they are using it to network, to share resources, to engage in different political dialogues, but then also how they manage their own way of behaving in these digital spaces to protect themselves and so on. So, I mean, I think in that case, that's one specific example of how we can see these digital spaces really creating a space for these women to continue their work with different types of partners. And again, in our mediation work, also Swiss Peace facilitates CSSR, which is the Civil Society Support Room, bringing Syrian civil society voices into the formal peace process. And digital has also provided a space for different types of people who previously couldn't travel to in-person meetings in Geneva, for example, to now
Mhm.
participate at different times around their care duties and so on. And so I think that one has also added a lot of access to different people to participate, but then also brought some different challenges of how to build new relationships online. I think it's one thing to kind of continue relationships that were started
Yeah.
offline in digital spaces, but it has been a little bit of a different challenge to build new relationships there. And then also sometimes, not from these two examples, but from some of our other work, there's a little bit of a maybe a sense of less commitment to objectives or some things that are settled on in digital spaces. They sometimes fall by the wayside a little bit faster than things that were maybe agreed upon in person. So it's just kind of understanding these little nuances and then kind of figuring out how to make sure what happens in digital spaces is treated with the same kind of gravity as
Yeah.
what was happening in the previous offline spaces.
Yeah. You just mentioned trust and building relationships where you can talk about emotional load and very often security implication topics. And at the same time, as you said, these commitments, is there the same commitment? Is there the same commitment to agreements? And I'm just wondering, when we talk about digital tools, very often we talk about human-centered design so that we really make sure that people have access, that people feel appreciated, that people see it meets their preferred way of engaging in these often very messy, scary, risky processes. What can you tell us about insights into the importance of human-centered design for digital places, digital spaces in the wider field of digital peace building?
Yeah, I think I mean, I'm a big fan of human-centered design, so I'll say that already at the start. But I mean, I think it plays an important role in helping us to ask questions about our own ideas of what we think is going to work on the ground. I mean, because another thing that I talk about with digital peace building ideation is, I mean, because there's excitement around different tools and how to use them. So I think sometimes we tend to start with the tool and then kind of just
Hmm.
search around and be like, okay, well, I want to use this. It looks cool.
Yeah, yeah.
How can I do a chatbot or whatever? And so with human-centered design, we kind of take the opposite approach where you're really trying to focus on the specific challenge at hand and the actual people who are being affected by this challenge or who are working on it, all of the different stakeholders from different sides, and then kind of working back to ask these questions about, okay, we have this idea, but does it meet these specific needs of the different people that we're talking about? And if we really dig deep into the details of how people use their time, how far they have to travel to participate, what care duties do they have, what's the weather like, what's the infrastructure like, what's the digital literacy like? I mean, these are all the questions that we can ask. And often the answer is not always what you want, because maybe it's you had this beautiful plan of a digital peace building project and now it's not exactly, you can't do it exactly as you thought. But I mean, it's how you strengthen your idea so that I think it teaches us to be open to feedback constantly and to kind of iterate and to do these small changes to make sure that you're kind of constantly checking in, because maybe an idea was working at first, but there's other circumstances that have changed. So being able to adapt your plan throughout, I mean, this is the strength of human-centered design, is that we can keep checking in and keep kind of adapting to make sure that actually what we're doing is relevant and useful and achieving the peace building goal or objective that we're working for.
Yeah. You just said, okay, constantly seeing that you get useful feedback to improve on what you're doing. You said sometimes the answers or the information we get is not really what we want. Is there an example you can share where you said, "Ooh, we had such a beautiful idea. Our ideas hit reality and we get the feedback and we get answers we first didn't expect, maybe didn't like." Is there a concrete example?
I can give a couple. I mean, so one is not from a project that I worked on, but from a teammate of mine where we were building a new digital platform for secure communications with these different partners. And there was a big focus on how to make the platform secure, how to make it user friendly and easy to onboard and so on. And there was lots of research done and questions asked and interviews to try to make this like beautiful platform that would be super easy and
Yeah.
super secure. And then in the end, in the implementation phase, people just didn't use it enough. I mean, they would
Yeah.
sometimes use it, but then of course people, switch back to other platforms they're more familiar with, like WhatsApp and so on. And so I think at some point when you put so much investment into building a piece of new technology, it can be really hard to know, like, when do I either shut this down or how do I find more funds to change it? Because how do I address whatever that pain point is that is the thing that's making people use other tools rather than this one? And so that was one that even despite lots of groundwork being laid and lots of kind of research, the reality in using the tool was not quite what we were expecting at the outset. So that's maybe more of a bigger one related to building technology.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I can even say, I mean, I just finished a pilot project in Moldova with the UN where we're using Polis, this open source platform to do youth dialogue. I mean, they start online using Polis, but then we're trying to lead them into something else. So, I mean, this is a pilot project. So our purpose of doing the work is to learn and to see how people are engaging on these platforms. And I think on this case, the pilot was very successful. We had a great success rate in terms of like the participation from youth and the ideas that they were bringing in, and they seemed fine using this platform. But then when we kind of tried to replicate this with a different group of individuals, less targeted and with
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
different question, it was harder for us to get engagement. And so we kind of realized, okay, we can't just like copy and paste like what we did here there, and like these different community needs a more coaching, maybe more of a different facilitation styles for them to feel comfortable using this new tool. So I mean, that one, we're in the process now of kind of like figuring out how we can adapt our facilitation for different audiences. But that's another one that we're kind of thinking through these learnings as we go along.
Yeah, oh, that's interesting to hear. Okay, on the one hand, having the knowledge, the information, and also background insights into, for example, for a process which needs trust, which needs security, which needs a certain being off the radar. How do we provide a platform where people could engage and it's beautifully designed, user friendly? You mentioned all the words. And then at the same time, we have to meet people where they are. And how do we find the balance? And I know that from other work, I'm an above knee amputee, so I'm also engaged in disability issues. And there's a big platform just for people with disabilities, with amputations, and it's only by invitation. And it's meant to create a safe space. And there's hardly anything happening, despite quite a lot of resources being provided, because people are on WhatsApp, Instagram, despite all the risks, despite all the bullying, despite all the harassment. And how do we find the right balance? We meet them where they are, and we make sure we provide spaces which can be used. But that also leads me to the next question. If we have to meet people where they are, which I think is perfectly fine, and they are on the big platforms, which very often use models, algorithms, business models underpinning them, which are opposite to what we think is proper behavior, is good standard, is conflict sensitive, gender sensitive, you name it. Do you also engage with the big tech companies to say, well, here you have a certain responsibility and you cannot just be driven by a higher profit margin, by engagement, by time spent on the platform, no matter what brings people there? Do you have this engagement with Meta or others?
SwissPeace at the moment is not directly engaging with the big platforms, but I mean, we're certainly engaged with different civil society conversations going on, like giving recommendations for these types of things. I mean, certainly on the dealing with the past side, I mean, that community that we're a part of does a lot in terms of advocating for different content moderation
Hmm.
policies, and so on. And then, yeah, I mean, we're also, I'm starting to work a little more closely with my colleague who works on responsible business conduct. And so we're trying to get together to figure out how we can kind of push Swiss Peace's work to draw on her experience, but apply this more to tech companies. So this is an area that we're newly exploring. So I don't have more specific examples there yet. But I mean, certainly the advocacy work, I think, is a big part, or like it plays a super important role. And then I think maybe one other point is we do have an opportunity. I mean, okay, 2 points. One is we have an opportunity with Peace Tech to rethink from the beginning. So yeah, we have all the big platforms where a lot of people are, but there is a growing field of peace tech where people are trying to, and Polis that I already mentioned is one example of this, where people are trying to build in qualities that support social cohesion and peace building into the tech itself. And so maybe it's not what people are using for their casual social media use, but it can certainly play an important role for these kind of specific situations where we decide to meet in a place and have it to be a bit more neutral. So I do have hope that there's more potential there. Not that it's going to necessarily overtake the big tech, but that we can kind of use these spaces more, as an opportunity to kind of build in the things that are important to us. And then maybe one final thing is that I think we can still use those big tech platforms for peace building. I mean, there's many examples of peace builders doing great peace building work in like closed Facebook groups, for example, or facilitating dialogues that happen on chat, like Telegram or WhatsApp or something like that. And so I think it in and of itself, these platforms are not quote unquote peace tech, but when they're used in a kind of conscious way, I think they still have a lot of opportunities for actual peace building. And maybe just to mention that kind of related to our previous point, that I think we do want to meet people where they are, but sometimes you ask people what they want and they will tell you they want the thing that you're trying to build, that super secure, like easy to use extra platform. So I think people also have personal ambitions to use this type of tech that they recognize also as being better. But then when it comes down to it, we're busy, like there's lots of the different things going on, and we take shortcuts, or we already have this app loaded on our phone or whatever the reason is. So I think sometimes there's also a disconnect between their ambition for themselves and then what the actual kind of daily user experience is.
Yeah, that resonates with me, and also just looking at my own behavior. Very often I find much of what we talk about work-wise and big picture thinking under our roof at home, where we're at the moment only 3 people, and you see different users, different priorities, and in different spheres of life, one takes priority over the other. Emma, I have a couple more questions. Oh, no, actually, I have plenty more questions, but let me just zoom in on 2 or 3 of them. One is, you said Swiss Peace also provides capacity building in relation to digital peace building, emerging tech and conflict throughout the whole project life, so to speak, maybe from the analysis baseline study side, from implementation, how can we actually use it for achieving results, but also monitoring, evaluation, documentation. What are some of the main challenges in building this capacity, and what are some of the capacity building opportunities you currently offer?
Well, we have a lot of capacity building opportunities that we offer. I mean, there's one course that is that's my course that's specifically on digital peace building, and this is where we're taking maybe a little bit of a zoomed out view to kind of define digital peace building, as we also started in this podcast, talk about these kind of flexible methodologies like human-centered design, for example, and kind of understand the landscape and the logic that I suggest, as in don't start with the tool, but start with the peace building objective and kind of work backwards from there. And then we take in a lot of different case studies and things like that. So that's our kind of general digital peace building course that we offer. And it happens once a year in June. But we have other courses that I come in and do a digital module on. So in our mediation course, in our communicating peace and conflict course, in the documenting and archiving course, these are 3 that we have digital components come in. And then we kind of talk a little bit deeper on specific tools. I mean, we also talk about tools in the digital peace building one, but kind of focused exactly on that area. So, and these courses are, I mean, they're open for anyone. I would say they're a little more targeted towards peace builders, humanitarians, and people working in development. I mean, people who have some experience already in these fields, but really want to hone in their skills on these specific areas. And I think they're good. They're quite successful. But something that I think about specifically with the digital peace building, capacity building, is that even if it's a big field, there's a lot of different skills that it's hard to decide what we should even focus on, on these 6 half days that we have for the course. And so if I'm having trouble designing the course like that, I can completely empathize with peace builders who are kind of worried about like, oh God, if I need to do digital peace building, it means I need to learn all of these different digital skills. Do I need to code? Do I need
Yeah.
to know all the current like policy updates and so on? And so I do think that although capacity building is a big part of it, and I do think peace builders need to get more comfortable, like just having conversations about technology and maybe like with technologists. I don't think it's all about capacity building. I think it's more about learning these kind of flexible methodologies that I already mentioned, and then finding out like who are the technologists who I can work with to actually help with the implementation. Because we just have to upskill ourselves to a point to be able to talk about it, to be able to kind of have a conversation, to know where we can bring in our peace building knowledge into the technology implementation, because the technologists, they also need upskilling like on
Mm.
the peace building principles. So then I think that's actually the main thing we need to focus on is once we get ourselves just to this kind of rather low tech level, all of those examples I mentioned are not specifically about tech. I mean, it's getting better at digital facilitation. We are already skilled facilitators. It's just kind of adapting it for digital spaces. The ideation processes, human-centered design, and then how do we just get better at making these partnerships with technologists that really
Mm.
work together to bridge this tech piece gap that sometimes exists.
I think that's such an important point. I think for some people it might be quite scary, especially with the speed of the development. And we say now discussions around AI and algorithms and weapons of math destruction and predictive design. And you mentioned it. And where I think some people said, sorry, it's too much. And I think it's so important to regularly have these platforms where people from the tech industry, where people from social justice movements, where people from the peace building field, from all levels, community based up to the UN, actually come together and just listen to each other, have informal chats, and actually also jointly explore what are some of the likely developments, what of that might be threatening, what of that might be really powerful also for peace builders, for social justice movements, and just listen to each other and get an idea, where do I need to understand things? Where do I need to be able to use things? Where do I need to be able to find people who can use them and provide services for me? And I think that's something where I would strongly encourage much more interaction. And I think there's some great designs where you have kind of the tech geek side coming together with social justice movements and peace building activists like Ushahidi and others. And you have others where it's still very much separated, where we look at each other with suspicions and say, well,
Yeah.
that's the other side. That's the dark side. And just being more open there, and at the same time also being able to ask critical questions and really explore where might that lead to and how do we have to be prepared, and not just prepared in a reactive way, but also prepared in an open way and saying how can we preemptively explore the possibilities while also being aware of some of the threats, the negative impacts, or the potential destructive authoritarian traits which are inherent in most of these things.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, great. Emma, time is slowly coming to an end, unfortunately, and I really enjoy having someone who has a computer data background and comes from this Silicon Valley world, but also has a proven track record in peace work. Emma, we talked about your work. We talked about the work from you and your partner organizations and people you regularly engage with. But if we go a bit broader, I ask all of the people on the show to also share one additional resource around digital peace building, which is not from your own work, which can be an event, which can be a book, which can be audio material, which can be manual. Is there anything you can share with others who want to dive deeper into the wide and still emerging field of digital peace building?
Sure. I actually have two, if you don't mind.
And that's perfectly fine.
Okay. So one of them is the Digital Peace Building Guide. It's created by Build Up and Search for Common Ground, and it's an online digital tool that really exemplifies that logic that I was talking about earlier in the podcast. Because the user journey that you go on is they present first these peace building challenges that are common challenges or goals that peace builders work for, and then once you kind of choose the one of interest to you, then you go back and kind of pick some different methodologies and then go into some specific tools. And then they have some examples of how others have used them in these spaces. So it's a great way to learn about tools that you could use, but you kind of always anchor it in that peace building objective. And it's something that I talk about a lot in my course. And when they made that tool, it was like, oh, and now you can go explore that and use this tool. So it's a really
that
handy one that I
that
recommend.
sounds very exciting. Where can people find it?
So it's on their platform Connexus. I'm sure it's linked also on Build Up and Search for Common Ground, but we
Yeah.
can put the Connexus link in the show notes, I hope.
Yeah, I'm going to put that in the show notes. That's great. So that was the first one. You said you have a second one, which I
Yeah.
think is great.
The second one is a podcast. I mean, it's maybe I'm sure others are listening to this, but the Tech Policy Press podcast is a really useful place to keep up on like policy journalism related to tech. And I'm sure many of us are facing the challenge. I mean, I'm talking about myself here too, of like, how do I keep up on all of the different policy things that are going on, the conversations that are happening in different countries and so on. And it's hard for me to read all of the reports and news that come out. So I really love an audio format. And I think Tech Policy Press does a really good job of bringing in smart guests and having these great, but still concise conversations that, keep me knowing what's going on and kind of these themes that are a little bit more high level or in the background, but then they can inform maybe the more practical peace building work that I'm doing.
That sounds great. I'm a great fan of audio resources because unfortunately I don't find the time to read anymore, at least not to the extent I would like to. So podcasting, audiobooks is great. And I'm also going to put that on my list. So thank you for something really practical from Build Up and Search for Common Ground on the one side and something more on the policy level, keeping yourself informed level. That is great. Last but not least, where can people find you and your work? What's the address of swisspeace so that I also put that in the show notes and then we slowly wrap up.
Thanks. So we have a digital peace building page on our website. It's swisspeace.ch. And then if you go to our program section, click on digital peace building. I always keep this up to date with the recent publications and activities that we're working on. So keeping an eye on that digital peace building page on our website is the place to be. And then also on LinkedIn, we're pretty active sharing our different work across our thematic areas. So that's another place to go to kind of see us passively in your feed and keep up to date with swisspeace.
Emma, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show. It was an exciting discussion. I hope we can one day pick that up again and maybe do another episode. And until then, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bjorn. It was a really fun conversation.
So much for today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of the future episodes. And I would really appreciate if you leave me a rating on iTunes, on Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more about the Peacebuilding Practitioner, head over to my webpage. That's www.thepeacebuildingpractitioner.org, where you find plenty of articles from practitioners for practitioners. And if you want to dive even deeper into this field of work, join us for one of our online courses. If you want to learn more about that, just get in contact with me. You find the contact details in the show notes or on my webpage.